Thank you all. We're going to go ahead and get started. So today we have with us Eric Min from our very own political science department. Eric Min is an assistant professor of political science here at UCLA. Before coming to UCLA, he got his graduate degree at Stanford University. He works on all sorts of very interesting issues. A large project that he is now finished that he's presenting here today is his work on negotiation during war. He is also a distinguished teacher here at UCLA, won that this year, so very happy for him. So I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Maggie. Thank you to everyone being here in person as well as online and to the Berkeley Center for having me. I really appreciate it. Let me just take a second to get the screen shared so get things going. Let's see if it works. Okay, great. All right, so I'm really happy to be able to present to you, as Maggie mentioned, this recently finished and published book called Words of War: Negotiation as a Tool of Conflict. I want to start this presentation kind of the way I start the book by comparing two different stories of diplomacy in two different wars. The first conflict that I want to talk about is the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, a big struggle between these two empires at the turn of the 20th century. One of the defining features about the Russo-Japanese War is the way in which it ended with a relatively swift diplomatic settlement. Here we have pictures of the Russian and Japanese representatives meeting in Portsmouth under the mediation of President Teddy Roosevelt. And what's notable is that the first time, and really the only time they spoke, was 95% of the way into the overall war's duration. Those talks remained kind of active for the remaining 5% of the war. And ultimately, they wrapped up pretty swiftly a settlement that codified the fact that Japan had pretty much trounced Russia on the battlefield in that war. If we fast forward 7 or 8 decades or so, we find ourselves in the Falklands War of 1982. Here, we have a lot of diplomatic activity take place throughout the entire war. One example of that is Secretary of State Alex Haig meeting Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She didn't look very happy to see him, and that's, I think, intentional. She doesn't want to talk, but talk she does. In fact, the first negotiations of the war happened 5% of the way into the conflict's overall duration, and about half of the war is spent having some active communication between the belligerent states of the UK and Argentina. Ultimately, though, most of the negotiations that take place during this war completely fail to bring any semblance of peace. And it's when British troops end up landing in the Falkland Islands and retaking it by force that the Argentinians have to sign an instrument of surrender. Now, there are obviously a lot of different reasons these wars differ, but one of the questions that sort of motivated this project is trying to understand whether these different stories of diplomacy in these wars are just coincidences or whether there's something deeper underneath all of it. So that leads to the book's motivating question of what is the role of negotiations in the midst of war? And I think this is an important question because if you look back at the last 2 centuries of interstate war, you see that about 2/3 of those wars have ended through some form of negotiated settlements. So diplomacy obviously has to matter in thinking about how wars ultimately often come to an end. Despite that fact, if you look at the academic literature, we don't actually have a very strong understanding of how exactly diplomacy works during war or why we would actually do it. Bargaining models, which are sort of game theoretic models, arguably are a forefront of this literature in political science. And if you look at many of these models, they don't really think very much about diplomacy. And to the extent they actually consider negotiations, they include them as this sort of costless, mechanical, and earnest instrument that basically lets the belligerents drift slowly closer and closer to some sort of mutually acceptable agreement. That all sounds nice and feels intuitive, but it actually butts up really badly against the historical record, where we see that the history of diplomacy during war is much more complicated and much more sort of non-linear than many of these models of war would suggest. And I'd say that that's a pretty significant shortcoming in our understanding of how to bring wars to an end. So with that in mind, my book attempts to develop a theory about wartime negotiation, how, why, and what happens and what the consequences of it are. And ultimately, there's a lot of things I try to argue in the book. But one takeaway point that I really hope to impress is that negotiations have to be understood as not only a tool that helps to settle wars, but also as an instrument that's sometimes used to manage, fight, and potentially win these wars as well. So to make this argument, I first want to delineate 2 ideal types of negotiation. On one side of the spectrum, we have what I might call sincere negotiation, which refer to good faith attempts to try to find some sort of potential agreement. Now, this is a designation about intentions rather than outcomes. Just because you don't get an agreement doesn't mean that it wasn't sincere. But the whole point, especially in the wartime context, of sincere negotiations, that actors come to the table because they actually want to try to avoid additional conflict. Most negotiation literature, I would argue, implicitly sort of adopts this idea that negotiation is a sincere activity where everyone comes with the hopes of making something work out. But in the book, I really want to impress that there's another part of this spectrum, an opposite side that often isn't really appreciated as much, which is what I call insincere negotiation. Insincere negotiation refers to bad faith attempts where actors may try to exploit negotiations for what some negotiation scholars, especially decades ago, called side effects. Side effects, according to these scholars, are consequences of negotiation that are unrelated to whether a deal is actually made. In the context of war, there are two particular side effects that might be useful for belligerents when they decide to negotiate insincerely. And both of them are sort of tied together by this idea that belligerents don't want to avoid more war by negotiating, but they instead want to change or reshape the trajectory of the war in their own favor. Two common ways in which this actually plays out in practice. One involves a political angle. Sometimes belligerents will try to go into negotiations, have them fail, and use that as an instrument to deflect political pressure and to try to blame the other side for being the recalcitrant party, try to get more people on their side. But there's also a militaristic angle as well. Many of these states will use negotiations as a moment of breathing room to try to stall for time on the battlefield, to give themselves an opportunity to regroup, remobilize, and rearm themselves so that they can hopefully fight more effectively once these negotiations fall apart. So I want to highlight that these two different kinds of negotiation exist, that this latter type is often underappreciated by negotiation scholars. And the puzzle that we want to try to explain in the book is how, when, and why each type of negotiation is actually used in the midst of war. To build up this argument, I first want to talk a little bit about the general logic behind why you might choose to negotiate or not in conflict. Given that most of the time belligerents don't talk to each other in war, it might be easier to first think about why belligerents are so reticent to communicate with each other in active conflict. There's a couple key reasons it might be true. One is sort of this larger structural issue where the two sides may think there's really no point to negotiating a deal because I simply cannot believe that the other side would actually abide by the terms of an agreement. And in political science parlance, we'd call that the existence of a major credible commitment problem. But there's one other factor that often isn't thought of as much that can explain why actors don't like talking to each other during conflict, which is that if you offer to communicate with the enemy, many times leaders seem to think that this signals weakness and flagging resolve to the other side. And that this can be dangerous because it might embolden the enemy to fight harder on the battlefield, thinking that you're sort of ready to give up, and that it could deflate support for war on the home front. In a relatively recent book by Oriana Scarla-Mastro, she calls this concern the risk of adverse influence, that if I'm willing to talk and I make it too obvious, others are going to start trying to take advantage of me. And historically, there are many anecdotes of leaders often being very worried about offering to negotiate for exactly that reason. And this helps to explain why often actors don't talk to each other when they're fighting. But we do know that they do eventually come to the bargaining table. So in thinking about reasons to negotiate, we come back to sincere and insincere forms of diplomacy. Because one obvious reason, why states may choose to come back to the bargaining table in war is that they simply don't think it's worth fighting anymore. They're suffering, they're losing, it's only going to get worse, so we might as well try to settle our differences and write an agreement down. But I want to, again, impress this idea that that's not the only reason you might choose to negotiate. An actor may try to reshape the war in their favor by engaging in insincere negotiations, trying to redirect political pressure, trying to rearm and remobilize for further conflict. So ultimately, in my theory chapter, I argue that there are two key factors that help to explain both when negotiations are more likely to occur in war, as well as what kind of negotiation is more likely to take place. The first factor I focus on is not new. It's certainly something people have recognized in international relations literature, which is the existence of clear information that is trickling in from the battlefield. A classic IR way of understanding war is that war is an honest and costly way to reveal real information about one another's capabilities and resolve. So if the battlefield starts trending very heavily and consistently in one side's favor, then it should make it more clear to both sides that they should have a common understanding of where the war is headed and make at least one side more likely to think, I need to stop fighting because this isn't worth it. So the more battlefield information we're getting that's clearly directed in one side's favor, the more likely it is that negotiations that take place in those moments would be sincere efforts to stop the war. So that's the first factor. The second factor relates to something that I call latent external pressures for peace, which are these sorts of pressures that can be activated by the international community to try to get actors to talk to each other. These could be international institutions that have sort of a peace lobby, international organizations, international laws, international norms, etc. If we live in a world where latent external pressures for peace are very low or sort of non-existent, then I argue that the costs to initiating negotiations are high for the reasons that I stated on the previous slide about your fear of looking weak and potentially signaling a lack of resolve. In that situation, talks won't happen all that frequently because they're seen as a very costly act. But if they do happen, it's a pretty good signal that at least one side genuinely wants to stop fighting. So in those cases, we would expect talks to occur and to be more sincere. This is a visualization of this part of the argument, where on the x-axis we have battlefield information. And basically, I'm arguing that as we get more battlefield information, the likelihood of negotiations increases, and the likelihood of those talks being sincere is always pretty good, but gets higher and higher as we go rightward on that figure. In contrast, if we live in a world that has really high latent external pressures for peace, where third parties constantly are sort of twisting the arms of belligerents to talk to each other, then the cost to negotiating become really low. And in fact, the belligerents may feel cost to avoiding diplomacy. In those cases, those actors will talk sort of regardless of what's going on the battlefield, because it's not a reaction to the battlefield, it's just a reaction to third-party pressure. And this is interesting because it opens up the floodgates to allow belligerents to use negotiations for side effects that they think might help them in the war rather than bring the war to an end, which means that there'll be more insincere talks. So in contrast, if we're in a world with high external pressures, we should basically have negotiations happen very frequently and sort of all the time, but there should still be some loose connection between the amount of information on the battlefield and whether those talks are likely to be sincere. So these two figures together, I think, visually encapsulate the broad strokes of my argument. And the rest of the book is focused on attempting to substantiate the implications of these two figures. Now, as I'll note near the end of this talk, I do this in a variety of different methods, but arguably one of the main empirical contributions of this book is assessing these arguments using two new data sets that I've created that catalog over 1,700 battles and 189 periods of negotiations across 92 interstate wars between 1823 and 2003. I'm happy to talk more about these data if people are interested later, but I just want to give you just the broadest of strokes that we need in order to move forward for the purposes of the talk for now. When it comes to the battle data, there's a bunch of encyclopedias, dictionaries of battles that try to catalog these clashes. I collected all of them and coded them for whether or not those battles were won by the initiator of the war or the target of the war, and I score them positive or negative. This table basically shows that there's a roughly 50-50 split in battles won by initiators versus targets. A bigger challenge in terms of collecting data was data on negotiation, where I went through several hundred sources to just piece together what were days on which formal representatives of belligerent states exchanged offers with one another. There were ultimately 189 uninterrupted periods of these talks, but another way of seeing it is to say that there's about 17% of the time that belligerents were fighting, they were also talking to each other at the daily level. This is the kind of data that I was able to extract through a lot of data collection for quite a long period of time. So with that in mind, we can get closer to trying to understand the relationship between latent external pressure for peace, battlefield information, and negotiations. In order to measure latent external pressures for peace, I go through several strategies in the book. But one of the kind of main things I try, and I think one of the bluntest ways I attempt to capture this idea, is to leverage the existence of the post-1945 international environment. And I'm not alone in making this argument. Many international relations scholars have pointed out that the post-World War II environment was unique in the advent of multiple international institutions, organizations, laws, norms, etc., that pushed for peace and were against conflict, and that we're just sort of in a systemically different environment following the end of World War II. Now, it's worth noting, I'm taking that 1945 line from existing scholars, but also if you look at my negotiation data and just sort of hands off, ask the data, when is the moment that negotiations start becoming more frequent in wars? Those tests independently also point out 1945 as sort of a turning point. Just to kind of impress this point, if you look at pre-1945 wars, the rate of negotiations is about 11%. And then after 1945, that rate goes up quite a bit to 28%. Something is changing here, and we'll dig a little bit more into that change in just a couple minutes. Moving on to battlefield information, to create this measure, I turn back to the battle data that I described on the last slide, and I create a measure called a recent imbalance, which basically looks at what were the outcomes of war over the last 60 days, and to what extent did those recent battles trend in either belligerent's favor. An example of this measure here is from the Korean War, and I won't go into too much detail, but for those of you who know something about the Korean War, you know that it's in the first 9 months or so of the conflict that there's a lot more movement up and down the peninsula, and that's being reflected in this plot. And we have similar data for 91 other interstate wars. So with these data together, we can start doing the analysis. And just for those of you who might be technically interested, the way that I do this is adopting something called a multi-state model in order to understand the relationship between external pressures, battlefield information, and negotiation behavior. Briefly speaking, what the multi-state model does is it basically is going to break wars down at the daily level and say that on any given day, we can be in one of 3 different states of the world. We could be not negotiating, we could be negotiating, or eventually the war could come to an end. And then on the diagram, you see all these arrows that point out the particular transitions that might occur within this system. What the multi-state model allows us to do is to try to understand what factors help to explain each one of these different transitions, either in and out of negotiations or through a military victory defeat. Oh, I forgot there's a touchscreen, sorry. Or from negotiations to termination, which would be a negotiated settlement. So one of the real strengths of the multi-state model is that you might have any variable that you want to know, like what effects does it have on negotiations or war? And the multi-state model allows that variable to have different effects depending on which transition you're looking at. So it doesn't make us kind of assume that a single variable has to have the same effect across the entire war. For those of you who do quantitative studies of conflict, we can talk more about this later. I add a lot of control variables that are quite classic to this literature, but we don't have to talk about that now. With all that set aside, I want to talk briefly about the top line results. And I'm going to show some visualizations of coefficient plots, but honestly, I will just ask that you believe my verbal summaries of the coefficient plots, and we'll just move forward. It's probably an easier way to go. So the first thing I did is I applied my multi-state model to pre-1945 wars, which I argue are an environment with relatively low latent external pressures for peace. And again, here's the coefficient plots, but let me describe the 2 takeaway findings from this analysis. The first one is that when there's more information coming out of the battlefield in terms of recent imbalances on the battlefield, we have an increased likelihood of negotiations starting. In addition, that same increase in battlefield information is also tightly related to negotiations successfully ending wars. It increases the likelihood of a negotiated or diplomatic settlement. So that's what we see in a world with low external pressures for peace. Now, if we run this same model on post-1945 wars, where I argue there's a much higher systemic level of external pressures for peace, things look a little bit different. The key difference here is that battlefield information no longer has a really meaningful connection with whether or not negotiations take place during conflict. Negotiations just kind of happen willy-nilly all over the time, regardless of what's happening on the battlefield. However, if negotiations do take place and there's a lot of battlefield information that trends in one side's favor, we still see that those negotiations are more likely to successfully end the war. If we take a couple steps back, essentially these results align with what these diagrams illustrate in terms of encapsulating the theory. And these results are also quite statistically stable, right, in terms of being robust. Now, one thing I don't want to dig into too much, but it is important for the service of the overall argument, is elsewhere in the book, I show that periods of active negotiations are also related to lower levels of contemporaneous fighting on the battlefield. So when belligerents are talking, they don't fight as intensely as they usually do. And this is really important because part of the story here is that negotiations might be useful as a moment of breathing room in order to rearm and regroup and to fight later more effectively. So with that in mind, I want to show one last set of results that sort of speak to insincere negotiations and what effect they might actually have on future fighting. So the question here might be, if a negotiation doesn't end a war, what happens in the conflict after that failed negotiation? To analyze this, I use a bunch of regressions where basically compare what battlefield activity looks like in the moments before negotiation and compare it to what the battlefield looks like immediately after those failed negotiations. And once again, I can show coefficient plots, but it's easier to sort of relay the main findings in words. And there's two main findings here that are tightly related. The first finding is that when talks fail to end a war, we see systematic evidence that subsequent fighting on the battlefield tends to favor the war target. So oftentimes before the war initiator does better, after these talks fail, war targets seem to regain some of the initiative. And I interpret this pattern as sort of a testament to the fact that war targets use negotiations to often mitigate some of the war initiator's first mover advantage, their initial strategic advantages in striking first. The second finding, which is tightly related, is that failed talks are also followed by subsequent fighting that is more consistent with what we might expect to happen on the battlefield. So if you looked at the two sides' pre-war military capabilities and believed that that relationship should roughly kind of predict what the battles should look like or what the war should look like, that equilibrium really seems to set in after talks that fail to end a war. And these results are also quite statistically robust as well and show that there's a tight relationship between failed talks and shifts that occur on the battlefield. So as I mentioned, this quantitative analysis is a key part of the contribution of the book on the empirical level, but I do want to just kind of briefly highlight that it's part of a larger constellation of approaches that I take to substantiate the argument. So chapters 3 and 4 have a lot of the statistical stuff I just explained, but they also have in-depth case studies of several conflicts across space and time. Chapter 5 is a really in-depth study of the first Arab-Israeli war and ultimately makes the point that insincere negotiations didn't only matter, but might have been instrumental to Israel's ability to survive as a state in its early months of existence. And then chapter 6 is about the Korean War. And this chapter I think is really interesting in that it combines both qualitative analysis of the Korean War, but also includes some statistical analysis where I gathered daily operation reports from the military, as well as full negotiation transcripts across the entire war. And I used supervised machine learning methods and text analysis methods to create fine-grained data that substantiate my theory on a much more granular level than on what I'm able to do with quantitative analyses in the preceding chapters. So with that, let me just briefly wrap up by saying that, again, one of the main points I hope to impress upon readers of the book is that negotiations don't only reflect the battlefield, but can also be used to reshape them in some way. And I think this is an important corrective to a lot of existing literature that doesn't really pay much attention to diplomacy in war because it sort of treats it as being cheap talk or sort of just this side process. It's a central process to understanding conflict. One of my hopes is that the data that I collected that I briefly shared with you won't only be useful in helping to support my theory, but also to other scholars of war who might be interested in doing more intra-war analysis, which isn't as common to this day, but hopefully this can change that. And then, as I'm sure we might talk about in the Q&A session and with Maggie, the findings of my book are complicated in terms of what it means for policy with respect to diplomacy and especially third-party diplomatic intervention in conflicts. It doesn't give any simple answers, but one of the things that it does impress is that sometimes policymakers sort of have this notion that it can't hurt to try to negotiate, because the worst case scenarios is that these deals don't work out and the war just continues as it was before. My theory and evidence sort of suggest that that might be a naive way of understanding diplomacy, and that sort of naively deployed diplomacy might not only lead to no peace, but could actually exacerbate conflict in some way, and that we need to be careful about those possibilities and how people might intervene in these active conflicts. So with that, I'll wrap things up. Thank you very much for your attention thus far, and I look forward to our discussion.
All right. I'm going to start out and ask Eric a couple questions. Alexandra, you're going to help me with the chat. Okay. And for those of you online, please feel free to put questions into the question section, and then we'll open it up. So here's my first question for you. Imagine I'm the British Foreign Secretary, and the Pakistanis call me up today and are like, we want to negotiate with the Indians. How do I know that they're sincere versus they're just worried about getting their butts kicked and want time to prepare?
Yeah. So I would say that in the context of this theory, it's more likely than not that in this sort of position, that sort of diplomatic activity has a higher likelihood of being insincere than sincere. Because a lot of the arguments suggest that sincerity is mainly born from like an actual sort of common understanding that the war should come to an end, and we sort of have an idea of how that war should come to an end. But if we're at this initial stage where obviously there's been a lot of terrible violence, but we haven't gotten to the war stage yet, I don't think there's that common understanding that exists that would be a useful actual starting point for meaningful negotiations. And that, you know, maybe something's there, but it's more likely than not that it's more for kind of either posturing or kind of getting on people's good side, showing that I'm the more sort of peace affirming party, and hoping that people get good vibes from me from that, more so than actually ending the conflict.
Great. All right. So continuing with that example, or thinking about Russia, Ukraine, should the international community be so invested in trying to do negotiations? Or even though it feels really painful because innocent civilians die on each side, is it better to let the war play out?
Yeah, so this is one of those complicated things that I was touching on the last the bullet points, and I spend a lot of time talking about in the conclusion of the book, where it's really not like there's sort of this reductive view sometimes in policy debates that either we should just let them completely fight it out, sort of Edward Lovelock's like give war a chance, or that we just need to continue to sort of, you know, push because it can't hurt to negotiate. I don't think either one is necessarily true. But in the context of Russia, Ukraine, I think that the current sort of efforts to just sort of push for diplomacy and just kind of throw a lot of proposals at them, and especially the Trump administration doing like multiple ultimatums, just saying like, take this or else we'll walk away, are not particularly productive. And that if third-party actors actually want to have some meaningful effect on negotiations having more likelihood of succeeding, there has to be more than just these diplomatic sort of presses. You have to kind of expand things out more to what these third parties offer in terms of military aid or potential security guarantees. Some of these more costly sort of things that have to be considered and done in order to reshape the actual incentives of the actors to settle. But just like continuing to bang on their door and tell them like, you need to keep talking, or here's an idea, what do you think of it, without doing some of those more serious things that reshape fundamental incentives, like those probably aren't going to work and might be more just for posturing of the third parties, like again, them saying they're doing something rather than meaningfully having a chance at succeeding at striking peace.
Great. So if you imagine you were on President Harris's in the alternate timeline negotiating team, what do you think, or what do you think you would do in Russia, Ukraine? How would you approach the situation?
Yeah, so I think there's no need to completely give up on diplomatic efforts. But one of the changes that I would make is, instead of continuing to just like push all these different proposals, sometimes that they're kind of detached from the reality of the war as well. It's really just about making proposals. I would always say that we are sort of standing ready to be ready to help kind of facilitate communication, and kind of leaving that window open rather than forcing them sort of through the door of diplomacy. And then, as I sort of mentioned, if I was on the Harris team, it would be about like, what are the other sort of policy policies that we could enact in order to either make Russia feel like more secure that they're not in some sort of jeopardy with NATO or whatever, and also make Ukraine feel secure that them making a deal actually means something and that it would be upheld and that third parties would help to enforce it rather than not, or about like what additional pain could we press on Russia to make them feel that the prosecution of this war is incredibly costly. Because sure, it's costly, but like, could we make it hurt even more, again, to change the fundamental incentives to seriously think about settlement? So it's about like all these other things you do on top of negotiations and not just this kind of continuous insistence on talking without considering more of those other policies.
Great. All right, let me open it up to the room.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to, this is a great talk, and definitely Putin came to mind when you were talking about the insincere angle. But, I wanted to follow up on that question of third-party mediation, because a lot of your external factors focused on the more systemic, structural.
Yes.
And so when you were doing the in-depth case studies, Arab-Israeli or Korea, did you tease out best practices for the third-party mediators? You mentioned some, in terms of testing when on the battlefield,
Sure.
using other levers. But is that part of your theory? Because I didn't see it as much. What role do mediators play in diplomacy? And here we could go back to the Russia-Ukraine. Saudi Arabia kind of injecting itself and
Sure.
being this platform. One could argue maybe not so sincere. They're looking for spillover or what you call, side effect benefits or so forth. So are there anything, any part that focuses on that mediation? And then the second question, what about non-state actors, which are a big part of our world today? You
Sure.
looked at only interstate, but do you believe your theory would apply?
Sure. No, thank you for those questions. So with respect to what I learned about mediators' best practices there, I'll admit that's not the core of the theory, right? And a lot of the empirical leverage is from sort of this like systemic change. That said, when I did look more at sort of the qualitative case studies and also leaning upon some pre-existing mediation literature as well, there are some best practices that I think come to mind. One of them, as I was sort of hinting at or alluding to, is that mediators who sort of stand like ready to help facilitate negotiations rather than just sort of bringing a bunch of proposals to the table often are a little bit more helpful. One thing that I did note in several cases, including like the Turco-Cypriot War in 1974, is that sometimes mediators would not really communicate. Sorry, in that case, the US and UK were the particular sort of mediators that had the strongest drive. There's a lot of evidence they didn't communicate with each other, right? They had different goals. They just kind of, one of them went through this Geneva Conference framework. Kissinger just talked to the belligerents himself, and then Foreign Minister Callahan, the UK, was incensed when he found out that Kissinger was just doing things on his own, right? So there was no coordination. It was just individual actors just trying to solve things on their own. And there are multiple examples where there could be mediators that might do something more productive, but when they're not on the same page, and either might be kind of at cross pressures or make it easy for the belligerents to just sort of bounce one another off each other, that's not good. The other thing that's notable, and this is true in multiple cases, including Israel-Palestine recently, is that mediators need to create proposals that are reactive to what is actually going on the battlefield or is being learned from fighting. One of the notable things about the recently failed ceasefire with Israel-Palestine is that plan, which kind of came into being in early January, was pretty much largely the same plan that the US, Qatar, and Egypt had floated since last May. Like, things kept changing in the war, and they just kept bringing the same proposal over and over and over, right? There was no reaction to the battlefield. And unsurprisingly, those sorts of proposals tend not to work out, right, in the end. So I think there are a lot of those sorts of pieces of advice that come from looking at the qualitative studies about the judicious application, sort of coordination of mediators to kind of get the job done. With respect to non-state actors, I speak about this a little bit in the conclusion of the book, where obviously my initial motivation was interstate war. That's what brought me into this. But in many ways, I actually think that a lot of the findings and ideas of my argument apply almost more so to civil conflicts. And I mean that in two different ways. One is that civil conflicts relative to interstate wars have a much more sort of asymmetric power dynamic, right, between the belligerents, because it's usually a host like a government and rebel groups. In that case, I think insincere negotiations might be an even more sort of compelling or necessary tool for non-state actors in order to have some sort of fighting chance. And in fact, I would actually argue Civil War literature was several steps ahead of interstate war literature in acknowledging that diplomacy is a strategic act, because we have a lot of research about how non-state actors love the opportunity to negotiate with a government because it makes them look legitimate. It gives them sort of this like sheen that, state parties might not sort of feel in the same way. So I think non-state actors often have much more of a draw to like want to do this. Actually, I mixed my two reasons together. Yeah, so highly asymmetric, so more sort of reasons to do that, and also more of the incentives of non-state actors. Oh, and a third one, I guess, is I make a lot of hay of external pressures for peace being a thing, and that certainly is true in interstate wars. I think it's even more true in civil conflicts, that if major powers sort of press upon governments and rebel groups to talk, that pressure to negotiate is even more powerful than what international actors might be able to do in an interstate conflict. So I think there's many different reasons why a lot of the dynamics I'm talking about would actually happen more easily in civil conflicts. And in the book, I give multiple examples, like from the Syrian civil war, especially, where insincere negotiations happen all the time for both sides.
All right. I see Art's hand.
So, great book. Delighted to see that it's out.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. One has to do with this issue of sincerity and insincerity. So, and assessing it. When you get negotiations, you get two parties, and you've got the possibility that both are sincere, both are insincere, and one is sincere and one is not. So in two of those combinations, you're not going to get a successful negotiated outcome. How do we know whether it was one party that was insincere or both parties were insincere? So that's one question. Second question is about the role of negotiations and their strategic utility, and whether there's an issue of the strategic utility for domestic political reasons. That is, it's not just an issue of whether there's external pressure, but you've got to mobilize a domestic society, you've got to sustain a war effort, and sometimes sort of entering negotiations, which you can help scuttle through the terms you impose, nevertheless gives you more breathing space, not with the international community, but with your domestic society.
Right. Sure. Yes. So thank you for the questions. Also, thank you for your support with the book over the years. Partially exists thanks to you. With respect to the first question about how we deduce whether an actor is being sincere or not, that is a big challenge of the book, because theoretically it makes a lot of sense, at least in my mind, but this is about intentions, right? And I'm only able to really observe the outcomes of the negotiation. So in the quantitative analysis, in the book, I sort of make these assumptions that if a war comes to an end, that those negotiations must have been sincere. If it didn't come to an end, it could have been sincere, but it is also more likely that it's insincere. And I sort of kind of take those assumptions and run with them. But in a lot more of the qualitative analyses, that's where I have, I think, a lot more purchase on being able to actually understand what the intentions of the actors are. Because we're able to look at primary source documents or memoirs that they write after the fact, where they talk about the logic behind why they chose to communicate. And in many of those places, they're actually quite transparent. I mean, not to one another, but transparent to each other or to themselves, that like, yeah, we have no intention of actually making an agreement here. And in the Korean War case, especially, I have lots of examples where both the US and North Korea, China are clearly coming into talks just to sort of propagandize and to say that they're talking, but clearly amongst themselves, they're saying that we have no intention of settling. So I think the intentions part really comes out of looking at like what these people are thinking and saying qualitatively, and in the quantitative analysis, just making some assumptions that I think are reasonable about like what are the sorts of outcomes where we might expect at least one actor to be insincere, and just sort of play out the way that I would expect based on those assumptions. But it's much more of the qualitative evidence that I think speaks to the intentions. With respect to the utility of negotiations for domestic reasons, that's absolutely true as well. It might not be built into my theory quite as much, but again, qualitatively, there are many examples where this was the case. So, for example, in the War of the Roman Republic, which is one of my cases in my book, which no one's ever heard of, but it's a really interesting case from the 1840s. France, under Louis Napoleon III, decides to enter negotiations with the new Roman Republic, not because they have any intention of settling. In fact, they use that time to take their military to higher ground to lay siege on them as soon as the negotiations come to an end, but because Napoleon III is coming up on legislative elections and is really worried about recent news and how the war hasn't gone very well for France. So he just uses negotiations as a way to sort of relieve some of that pressure and get people to not, think so much about his foreign policy failure there, while getting ready to fight more ferociously and ultimately destroying the Roman Republic once those negotiations come to an end. And then many of these cases, including the Korean War, Vietnam War, the Seneca Valley War, there are multiple examples where these leaders are not only choosing to negotiate because they think outside parties want them to, but because there is some domestic constituency, whether it's sort of the more dovish people that want them to stop fighting, or trying to kind of increase support for the war by laying blame on the other side for not being willing to end the war. That does happen. And in fact, I would argue that the recent collapse of the ceasefire with Israel-Palestine, that part of that was also sort of domestically driven on Israel's part, at least, where some of the more right-wing members kind of wanted those talks to fall apart and kind of put new conditions on the deal in order to make it collapse. And that was very much a domestically motivated logic. So that's very much there, even though that might not be an explicit part of what my theory is trying to test.
You said that after failed negotiation, the target does better on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
For how long?
Yes. So it's for, it depends. So like I use several different sort of temporal windows for what I'm doing. And whether it's like 30, 60, 90, 120 days, oftentimes that advantage remains. It doesn't remain as strong over the entire time, but systemically something does change in terms of the dynamics on the battlefield. So it's not that turnaround eventually gets completely neutralized. It does get kind of chipped away, but it does last oftentimes throughout the remainder of the conflict, that something has fundamentally shifted. And even though we might get a little bit close to parity, statistically, like in terms of average effects, we do see that there's sort of this like durable change following these failed negotiations.
What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, so a main thing that I would attribute that to, and there's a lot of factors, but one of the main ones speaks to what I discussed with sort of the war initiator's first mover advantage. Strategically, striking first has a lot of benefits, both strategically and like you're just ready to go. You've sort of militarized yourself. I argue in the book that for many war targets, even if you kind of know a war is coming, and you might not know either, right? Sometimes you don't know for sure, that there's a gap between your kind of latent military capabilities, like what you could do if you had the time, and what you actually have on the battlefield ready to go at the initiation of a conflict. So what I would argue happens oftentimes with these insincere negotiations, especially for war targets, is that they get relatively large benefits from having that time to sort of mobilize more of their forces in order to fight closer to what they really think they can do, which is certainly the case like in the first Arab-Israeli war, where Jews were flowing into Israel as these ceasefires, the ceasefires were taking place, and kind of arming themselves up more effectively in that way. And there's other things going on, but I would say that's the main dynamic that I'm capturing here.
In the back, and then everybody.
So you identified 1945 as this like separating line where, if I understood correctly, post 1945, you have higher latent external forces pushing for these negotiations to happen.
Yes.
I wonder if you took in your research or in your book, do you go into more granularity within each of those spheres? And why I mentioned that, what I had in mind, I was thinking in the pre-1945, still in the colonial era, what would it be like if you're in a regional conflict and your suzerain says, we're not doing this anymore? And that's obviously like, to me, that would be even more meaningful than in today's era.
Sure.
So is that something that you looked into, or was that a challenge beyond the data set?
I mean, it is a challenge, but I did try to look into it in the book. So yeah, like as I mentioned in the presentation, the pre-post 1945 effect, I think, is a big one. So it gives me a lot of leverage, but it's also extremely blunt. So one thing I do try doing as sort of an alternative measure is whether or not the belligerents in the conflict, whether at least one of them was a major power or not. And the logic there is that if a war features no major powers, so it's only minor powers, that they should be much more likely to be pushed around compared to major powers. That is, major powers, like, they're not immune to these pressures, but that they're a little bit more able to kind of withstand international pressure to negotiate. And when I use that as a measure of susceptibility to pressure, I actually find that that's really meaningful. That when you have wars where the belligerents are all minor powers, they are way more frequently pushed into talks that they did not originally propose or orchestrate, and that many more of those talks are more likely to fail. And so that is the kind of more granular approach I took, and that's true both pre-1945, post-1945, but especially post-45, you see those effects being quite strong, because it's not only that there's susceptibility to pressure, there is just much more pressure post-45, which is partially what I was arguing.
One thing that made me think about is, since we just went into the papal conclave, if you think back to the Middle Ages, where occasionally the Pope would be like, hey guys, you're going to negotiate.
Yeah.
And then you don't actually see conflicts resolved after that. So it's not just that these institutions are totally new, but they are similar. All right. I have couple people, and we're kind of running out of time, so why don't we collect a couple questions? I'm going to start with one from online, and then we'll take her question and answer them both.
Right, online question. What is the role of elites and other actors who might undermine a head of state sincerity? How do these other actors factor into the assessment of sincerity?
Great.
And I know you touched a bit on failed negotiations, so I wanted to ask, do failed negotiations typically result in prolonged conflict or shorten the conflict, or is it just case by case?
Okay, great. Let me see. So let's start with the role of elites who undermine sincerity. So it is certainly true that my argument sort of takes this like state as a unit approach, where we're just talking about kind of a leader and what they want. I think it's certainly possible that if there's sort of domestic dissent inside a country, that can have unintended consequences from the perspective of government in terms of how negotiations go. That being said, I also would suggest that sometimes elites and sort of the pressure they put on leaders might be part of the reason, why sometimes these negotiations take place, which kind of goes back to Art's suggestion about domestic pressures to negotiate. So that would actually have been initially my sort of idea for how elites play a role in diplomacy, that they kind of create pressures on leaders to choose to talk. And maybe in those cases, you'd be more likely that those negotiations might be insincere, right? If the leader didn't want to talk and then elites want them to talk, they might just go through the motions of diplomacy but have it fail, or vice versa. So I do think that there is a place that elites can play in shaping that sort of policy. And there's a lot of really great work, including by Elizabeth Saunders, about how these foreign policy elites can affect what leaders do. So if you're interested in that, you should look into that. The Insider's Game is her most recent book on that. And then with respect to this question of whether failed negotiations lead to prolonged conflict, the answer is kind of complicated, but the shortest version of it is that pretty much yes, right? That like successful negotiations tend to shorten conflicts, and then failed negotiations don't shorten conflicts. So like that's a weird statistical finding, like to describe it that way. But basically it means that if talks fail, conflicts tend to last longer than they would have if negotiations hadn't taken place. And that's part of the dilemma about, pushing for negotiations, that if it's successful, the war might come to an end earlier, but if it doesn't work and you kind of do it in this inopportune moment, you might actually exacerbate the conflict.
All right, I got Noman and Cartland on my list.
My question is about public and private signaling.
Sure.
As I understand it, most of the negotiations that you talk about in the book are kind of private, right?
Mhm.
They're not publicly available. And also a lot of battlefield information are private, right? You don't want your belligerent or your adversary to know what you think about a battlefield, even if you think it's not going well. So what is the point of sometimes belligerents signaling publicly that they're willing to negotiate or not willing to negotiate? Like, what does that do to the negotiation process?
Yeah, so it's absolutely true. A lot of these negotiations that are in, especially my data, are kind of private behind the scenes affairs. But it is worth noting that even when there are private affairs, many of these belligerents will then turn around and either go home or speak to the international audience and say, like, it's either going well or it's not going well. If it's not going well, it's their fault. So one of the main reasons why these actors would make public pronouncements that, like, I'm willing to negotiate or not willing to negotiate is to try to create signals for both international and domestic audiences. So in particular, you see qualitatively in many of these cases in the book and others, that leaders might sometimes choose to offer to negotiate because they want to look like the magnanimous party. And their hope is that the other side will refuse to negotiate, or they'll like say, I'm willing to negotiate under these preconditions that sound reasonable to most people, but the other side will turn it down. And then they'll say, well, they're the difficult party, and therefore they get more support on their side. And you see a lot of that happening right now with Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, a lot of cases here. And then other times, sort of a cross-cutting dynamic is sometimes actors will publicly pronounce, I'm not willing to negotiate in order to, and I'm sure, you're aware of this, like the audience costs, like I'm trying to credibly show you that I will never falter by sort of making this very public pronouncement that I'll never talk to you, and therefore you should take this seriously. So it's often used as a signal of resolve to the other side. And if war is about learning this information, you might learn something about your capabilities, like how you are militarily by fighting. But this might be one way of trying to communicate how long you're willing to fight by just saying in front of everyone, like, I'll never negotiate with you.
Do you have any more questions for the chat? All right, Norman, did you think of your questions?
Yeah, okay. So my question, I think, revolves around two aspects. One is you discussed how minor states or small states can be pushed to conflict.
Yeah.
Are those states usually like fully independent states, or are they kind of proxies of other larger states?
Mhm.
And the second question is with this issue of capabilities, and I don't know if this is related to the book or not, but there have been recent cases in like Sudan and South Sudan where both belligerents are state entities, right?
Mhm.
And so we would expect that both sides should know each other's capabilities beforehand, or at least like the asymmetry shouldn't be as like very varying in comparison to like interstate or something.
Mhm.
So how does that factor into this issue of negotiating, given that I would assume that they know each other's capabilities,
Mhm.
and thus they are more willing to either sacrifice or just come to an agreement.
Mhm. Okay. So yeah, with respect to the minor states that I'm often talking about, I think in particular, post 1945, a lot more of the minor states, they are like independent states, but they're clearly have some colonial connections or legacies that often are part of what major powers are able to sort of push them into negotiations. So that's certainly true pre-1945 as well. But yeah, like none of these minor well, not none, but many of them are not just kind of fully independent states out of nowhere. They have some connections that major powers are able to leverage to push them into talks, certainly. And then with respect to your last question, if I could try to clarify, so you're saying both belligerents being states might have a decent understanding of each other's relative capabilities. I get to that point. And then I'm not sure I know like what the
State actors, both
yeah.
of them, like, because in both like recent wars in Sudan and South Sudan, both of the fighting forces are state entities.
Yeah.
And given that they're both state entities, we would expect both to know more about each other, given that they are part of the same security apparatus. They share a lot of information, intelligence. How does that factor into their negotiations?
Well, I think like I mean,
how do you expect them? Yeah.
Sure. So in that case, like if we're talking about states that might know each other's capabilities, that might be sort of true in some sense for all pairs of states that end up fighting each other. They kind of know something about themselves. But because you roughly know each other's capabilities, I don't think that necessarily first means you know everything about each other's capabilities or like what would actually happen if you started fighting. And then in particular, the other part that's sort of the big unknown, even if you were able to see every weapon that the other side had and everything in the military, the sort of intentions and resolve, right? Kind of how long you're willing to fight and like what you're really fighting about, those might not be as clear to the two sides. So even with full understanding of capabilities, and I'm not the only one who's argued this, like just kind of questions of resolve might lead these parties to fight. Now, if it is a question mainly of if we're not worried as much about like what our relative capabilities are, and it's much more about like how resolved is the other side, how long can they fight it out? In those instances, I would think that there'd be much less incentive and desire to negotiate because offering to negotiate, like I said, even with these external pressures, might be one of those signals that like I'm starting to back down a little bit and sort of reconsider my options. So I think in those cases, those belligerents would have a lot of motivation to try to stay quiet or to at least make it look like I'm not interested in negotiating as much as they can, as long as they can withstand. And then if they get to the negotiating table being super difficult and not, showing any willingness to compromise.
Right. Well, on that note, it's 1:30. So thank you all so much for coming. We are back here on May 22nd in the afternoon for Professor Shana Potts from Geography, talking about her work on debt, sovereign debt, and other types of debt owned by states. So we'll be back here then.
Thank you very much. That's